Linda Thompson was counting her 20 for the third time when the clerk rolled his eyes and turned to his coworker. The bills were worn soft from years in her wallet, each one carefully smoothed flat against the glass counter of Anderson Arms and Tactical. She needed exactly $400 for the Remington 700, money she had been saving for 6 months to buy her brother Kevin his dream hunting rifle for his 50th birthday. The younger clerk, probably 19 with arms covered in fresh tattoos, snorted when she asked to see the rifle specifications. "Ma'am, this isn't really a gun for beginners," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe you should start with something simpler." Linda kept her expression neutral, the same way she had learned to do during countless briefings where younger officers thought they knew better. She had handled more weapons systems than this kid had seen in video games, but she simply asked again to see the rifle. The older clerk joined the conversation, shaking his head as he watched Linda examine her cash. "Lady, do you even know what caliber ammunition this takes?" he asked, crossing his arms. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Linda looked up from her money, meeting his gaze directly. 7mm Remington Magnum, she said quietly. Effective range of 800 yards with proper scope mounting. Standard hunting load, runs about 3,100 feet per second muzzle velocity. Both clerks exchanged glances, clearly not expecting that level of detail. The younger one laughed nervously. "Well, anyone can read that off the internet," he said. "But do you actually know how to shoot something like this?" The question was rhetorical, meant to embarrass her in front of the other customers who were starting to pay attention to the exchange. Linda felt the familiar weight of judgment settling around her shoulders, the same feeling she had carried through 2 decades of proving herself in rooms full of men who saw her as an outsider. The conversation was interrupted by the sharp chime of the front door opening. A man in an expensive suit entered, his posture immediately commanding attention from everyone in the store. The clerks straightened up instantly, their mocking expressions vanishing as they recognized their visitor. "Mr. Rivera," the younger clerk stammered, "we weren't expecting you today." The man nodded curtly, his eyes already scanning the shop floor with the practiced assessment of someone conducting an inspection. Marcus Rivera, CEO of Anderson Defense Contractors, had built his company from a single gun shop into a multi-million-dollar military supplier. His unannounced visits kept employees sharp and customers impressed. But today something was different. His attention was drawn not to inventory or displays, but to the middle-aged woman standing quietly at the counter, her worn $20 bills still spread across the glass surface. There was something about her bearing, the way she held herself despite the obvious discomfort of the situation. Rivera had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize certain tells. The way she stood with her feet shoulder-width apart, the unconscious habit of keeping her hands visible and ready. Most telling was the watch on her left wrist, a standard-issue military timepiece that had clearly seen years of active duty. He approached the counter, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet store. The clerks watched nervously as their boss inserted himself into what had been their private entertainment. "Ma'am," Rivera said, his voice respectful in a way that made both employees shift uncomfortably. "I'm Marcus Rivera. May I ask your name?" Linda looked up, meeting his gaze with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Linda Thompson," she replied simply. Rivera's expression changed instantly. His back straightened, his heels came together with military precision, and his right hand snapped up in a perfect salute. The entire store fell silent, every conversation stopping as customers and employees stared in stunned disbelief at their saluting this ordinary-looking woman they had just been mocking. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Rivera slowly lowered his salute. Linda nodded once, a slight acknowledgement that carried 20 years of military protocol. The two clerks stood frozen behind the counter, their faces cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and dawning horror as they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Rivera turned to face his employees, his voice carrying the authority that had built his company into a defense contracting empire. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "You have just had the honor of meeting Colonel Linda Thompson, retired. She served with distinction for 2 decades in Army logistics, including 3 combat deployments." The younger clerk's face went pale, his earlier bravado evaporating like smoke. "Colonel Thompson," Rivera continued, his respect evident in every word, "was responsible for coordinating supply chains that kept entire divisions operational in hostile territory. She has more experience with weapons, systems, and tactical equipment than anyone in this building." The older clerk stepped back from the counter, suddenly understanding why Linda had rattled off those specifications with such casual precision. Linda remained composed throughout Rivera's explanation, though she could see the growing mortification in the clerk's expressions. She had weathered worse storms than 2 gun shop employees having a bad day. What concerned her more was the way Rivera was studying her, as if he were calculating something beyond simple professional courtesy. The other customers in the store watched the drama unfold, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a moment worth sharing. The younger clerk finally found his voice, stammering an apology that sounded hollow in the charged atmosphere. Colonel, I'm sorry, I didn't know I thought." His words trailed off as he realized there was no adequate excuse for his behavior. Linda looked at both men with the patient expression of someone who had spent years training junior officers who thought they knew everything. Rivera's knowledge of Linda's service record went far beyond casual recognition. As he continued speaking, it became clear he had done business with officers who knew her reputation. Colonel Thompson didn't just coordinate supply chains, he explained to the still-stunned employees. She revolutionized them. Her logistics protocols are still being used by the Army today, 15 years after she developed them. Linda shifted uncomfortably as Rivera detailed achievements she preferred to keep private. The Bronze Star for her work under fire in Afghanistan, establishing supply routes through hostile territory that kept 3 forward operating bases operational during a 6-month siege. The commendation for designing inventory management systems that reduced critical shortages by 70% across an entire theater of operations. But what impressed Rivera most was something few people knew about. "Colonel Thompson," he said, turning back to Linda with obvious respect, "created the weapons accountability system that every major defense contractor now uses as their standard, including us." Linda's eyes widened slightly. She had developed that system during her final assignment at the Pentagon, working with contractors to prevent equipment losses that were costing taxpayers millions. The irony was not lost on her that she was standing in a gun shop owned by a company that used her own procedures. Rivera seemed to recognize her surprise. "Anderson Defense Contractors has grown from this single store to a $50 million operation," he said quietly. "We supply equipment to military bases across 3 states. But lately, we've been struggling with some logistics challenges that our consultants haven't been able to solve." Linda noticed the subtle shift in Rivera's tone, the way his casual conversation was becoming something more purposeful. She had heard that particular inflection before, usually from commanding officers who were about to request her expertise on problems that seemed impossible to fix. Rivera gestured toward a quieter corner of the store, away from the still gawking customers and embarrassed employees. "Colonel, would you mind if I asked your professional opinion on something?" he said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Linda followed him, her curiosity piqued despite her intention to simply buy a rifle and leave. The problem, Rivera explained, was both simple and catastrophic. Anderson Defense had landed the largest contract in company history, a $12 million deal to supply specialized tactical equipment to military installations across the Southeast. The timeline was aggressive but manageable, or so they had thought when they signed the agreement 6 months ago. Everything had gone wrong in the implementation. Their primary supplier in Germany had experienced manufacturing delays. Their backup supplier in Texas had quality control issues that resulted in rejected shipments. Most critically, their logistics coordinator had quit 3 weeks ago, leaving behind a maze of incomplete orders, confused delivery schedules, and mounting penalties for late deliveries. Linda listened with the focused attention she had always brought to crisis briefings. She could already see the outline of the disaster Rivera was describing. Military contracts were unforgiving, especially for newer companies trying to establish credibility. One major failure could destroy Anderson Defense's reputation and end their government contracting future permanently. Rivera's confession came with obvious reluctance. "We've hired 2 different consulting firms," he admitted. "Both came highly recommended. Both failed to untangle the mess we're in. The deadline is 6 weeks away, and at this point, we're looking at potential bankruptcy if we can't deliver." Linda recognized the desperation beneath his composed exterior. She had seen that same look on countless faces during her military career, the expression of someone watching their carefully built world collapse despite their best efforts to hold it together. Linda found herself agreeing to a brief consultation before she fully realized what she was committing to. Something about Rivera's situation reminded her of the supply crises she had faced in Afghanistan, where failure meant soldiers going without critical equipment. She followed him through a door-marked corporate offices and up a narrow staircase to Anderson Defense's headquarters. The conference room overlooked the gun shop below, but the chaos on the table made Linda forget about the view entirely. Papers were scattered everywhere, purchase orders mixed with shipping manifests, delivery schedules crossed out and rewritten multiple times. 3 laptops sat open, each displaying different spreadsheets that clearly contained conflicting information. Rivera's operations manager, a harried-looking woman named Sarah Chun, was on the phone arguing with someone about delayed shipments. She hung up with obvious frustration and turned to Rivera with news that made his face go pale. "Fort Bragg is threatening to cancel their portion of the contract," she reported. "They need their equipment delivered by next Friday, or they're sourcing elsewhere." Linda studied the documentation spread across the table, her trained eye quickly identifying patterns that the consultants had apparently missed. The problem wasn't just late suppliers or quality control issues, though those were certainly factors. The real disaster was systemic breakdown in coordination between multiple moving parts, each operating independently without understanding how their delays affected the entire chain. She picked up a shipping manifest dated 3 weeks earlier, comparing it to a purchase order from the same period. The numbers didn't match, and when she traced the discrepancy through other documents, she found a web of errors that had compounded into the current crisis. Rivera watched her work, hope flickering in his expression as he recognized the methodical approach that had made her legendary in military logistics. The phone calls started coming in rapid succession, each one delivering worse news than the last. Camp Lejeune had questions about missing components that should have arrived 2 weeks ago. Fort Stewart was threatening contract penalties for delayed tactical gear deliveries. By noon, it was clear that Anderson Defense was facing complete collapse of their military relationships. Rivera's desperation became impossible to hide as he fielded angry calls from base commanders who had trusted his company with critical equipment needs. Each conversation ended with threats of contract cancellation and warnings that word of unreliability spreads quickly through military procurement channels. Sarah Chun looked close to tears as she updated a whiteboard covered with red-marked delivery dates that had already passed. Linda spent 2 hours analyzing the documentation, her coffee growing cold as she traced the cascade of failures back to their origins. The problem was worse than Rivera had initially described. It wasn't just one $12 million contract at risk, but the company's entire future in defense contracting. Military buyers had long memories, and Anderson Defense was about to earn a reputation that would blacklist them permanently. Rivera finally approached her with a question she had been expecting. "Colonel Thompson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble. "I know you're retired, and I know this isn't your responsibility, but would you consider taking on this project directly? We need someone who understands both the military mindset and complex logistics coordination." Linda looked around the room at the stressed faces of people whose livelihoods depended on solving an seemingly impossible puzzle. She had planned to spend her retirement gardening and visiting grandchildren, not rescuing failing defense contractors. But the familiar pull of a crisis that matched her expertise was stronger than her desire for peaceful retirement. Linda agreed to take the temporary position with one condition: complete authority over logistics decisions until the crisis was resolved. Rivera nodded immediately, relief flooding his face as he realized someone with actual expertise was willing to tackle the impossible situation. Within hours, Linda had transformed the chaotic conference room into something resembling a military command center. Her first action was establishing a central tracking system that consolidated all the scattered information into one master database. She worked methodically, entering purchase orders, delivery schedules, and supplier contacts while Sarah Chun watched with growing amazement. This was the kind of systematic organization that the expensive consultants had promised but never delivered. Linda's military experience showed immediately in how she prioritized the most critical deliveries. Fort Bragg's order moved to the top of the list, followed by the other bases with the strictest deadlines. She contacted suppliers directly, using the no-nonsense communication style that had served her well in combat zones where delays could cost lives. But not everyone was impressed with the new leadership. The remaining logistics staff, two men who had worked for Anderson Defense for years, made their skepticism obvious. They questioned Linda's approach, suggesting that a retired officer might not understand civilian business realities. Their resistance became more pronounced when Linda implemented new procedures that required detailed documentation of every step in the supply chain. The tension in the office was palpable as Linda pushed forward with her systematic overhaul despite the internal resistance. She had faced similar challenges in the military when taking over failing operations, but the stakes here felt different. These weren't soldiers who could be ordered to comply. These were civilians who could simply quit if they disagreed with her methods. The crisis reached its peak on a Thursday morning when Linda discovered that their primary German supplier had shipped the wrong specifications for half of Fort Bragg's order. The equipment was already in transit, but it would be useless for the military's requirements. With only 8 days until the final deadline, there was no time for remanufacturing or replacement orders through normal channels. Linda's response demonstrated why she had earned her reputation in combat logistics. She immediately contacted her network of former military colleagues, reaching out to supply officers at bases across the country. Within 3 hours, she had located compatible equipment sitting and used at Fort Campbell, surplus from a canceled training exercise that perfectly matched Fort Bragg specifications. The reluctant logistics staff watched in amazement as Linda coordinated a complex three-way transfer involving military protocol, civilian transportation, and federal paperwork. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the office and surviving on coffee and determination while orchestrating the kind of miracle that had made her legendary among Army logistics officers. But the real test came when Fort Stewart called with an emergency addition to their order. A training exercise had been moved up, and they needed additional tactical equipment delivered within 48 hours or face mission cancellation. The skeptical staff members openly doubted that Linda could handle the impossible timeline, suggesting that Rivera should prepare for contract failure. Linda looked at the doubters with the same calm expression she had maintained in the gun shop when facing ridicule. She picked up the phone and began making calls, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved mountains of equipment through war zones. The room fell silent as they watched her coordinate a solution that required perfect timing across multiple suppliers and transportation networks. The delivery trucks began arriving at Fort Stewart at exactly 0600 hours on Friday morning, 47 hours and 30 minutes after the emergency request had been made. Linda's coordination had worked perfectly, with equipment flowing from 3 different suppliers through 2 transportation hubs to arrive precisely when promised. The base commander called Rivera personally to express his amazement at the flawless execution. Fort Bragg's corrected order arrived on schedule 3 days later. The replacement equipment Linda had located at Fort Campbell delivered without a single missing component. The same officers who had threatened contract cancellation were now praising Anderson Defense for exceeding expectations under impossible circumstances. Rivera watched his phone ring with congratulatory calls instead of angry complaints for the first time in months. The skeptical logistics staff who had doubted Linda's methods were forced to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The man who had been most vocal in his criticism approached her desk on Monday morning with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am," he said, his earlier arrogance replaced with genuine respect, "I owe you an apology. What you accomplished last week was impossible according to everything I thought I knew about supply chain management." Linda accepted his acknowledgement with the same grace she had shown the gun shop clerks, understanding that competence often threatens people who have built careers on mediocrity. She had proven not just that she could solve the immediate crisis, but that her systematic approach could prevent future disasters from occurring in the first place. Rivera's relief was evident as he reviewed the final delivery reports. Andersen Defense had not only saved the $12 million contract, but had established a reputation for reliability that would open doors to even larger opportunities. The company that had been facing bankruptcy 6 weeks earlier was now being courted by procurement officers who had heard about their miraculous turnaround. Rivera organized a company meeting to formally recognize Linda's achievement, gathering employees from both the gun shop and corporate offices in the main store. The same clerks who had mocked her 6 weeks earlier now stood respectfully as Rivera presented her with a plaque commemorating her role in saving Andersen Defense. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the woman they had tried to dismiss as a clueless customer had rescued their jobs. The younger clerk, who had been the most condescending during Linda's initial visit, approached her after the ceremony with genuine humility. "Colonel Thompson," he said, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance, "would you be willing to teach me about firearms specifications? I realize I don't know nearly as much as I thought I did." Linda smiled and agreed, recognizing the value of turning former critics into allies. Rivera's offer came as no surprise, though its generosity exceeded Linda's expectations. He wanted her to stay permanently as director of military logistics, with a salary that reflected her proven value to the company. The position would give her authority over all government contracts and the resources to build a logistics department that could handle much larger operations than Andersen Defense had ever attempted. Linda considered the offer carefully, weighing her desire for peaceful retirement against the satisfaction of solving complex problems that matched her expertise. The work energized her in ways that gardening and grandchildren, as much as she loved them, simply could not. She had rediscovered the professional identity that retirement had temporarily set aside, but she also recognized an opportunity to do something beyond just helping one company. Her success at Andersen Defense had proven that her methods could transform struggling operations. There were dozens of veteran-owned businesses facing similar logistics challenges, companies that could benefit from someone who understood both military requirements and civilian business realities. Linda made her decision on a quiet Tuesday morning, sitting in the same conference room where she had first seen the chaos of Andersen Defense's failing logistics. She would accept Rivera's consulting offer, but on her own terms. Instead of a full-time position, she proposed working with Andersen Defense as her anchor client while building a broader practice helping veteran-owned businesses navigate military contracting challenges. Rivera understood immediately why this approach would benefit everyone involved. Linda's reputation for solving impossible logistics problems would attract other struggling companies to Andersen Defense's ecosystem, creating opportunities for partnerships and shared resources. The gun shop where she had been mocked would become the headquarters for a consulting practice that could transform the entire industry. The transformation was evident 6 months later when Linda returned to buy that hunting rifle for her brother's belated birthday gift. The same clerks who had once dismissed her now greeted her with professional respect, but more importantly, they treated every customer with the same courtesy they showed her. The incident had taught them that expertise comes in many forms, and judging people by appearance was both foolish and expensive. Andersen Defense had grown into one of the most reliable military contractors in the Southeast, with Linda's logistics systems serving as the foundation for expansion into new markets. The company that had nearly failed was now mentoring other veteran-owned businesses, sharing the systematic approaches that Linda had implemented during their darkest hour. Linda's consulting practice had helped dozens of companies avoid the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed Anderson Defense. Her reputation spread through military procurement circles, where officers remembered the legendary logistics coordinator who had kept supply lines open in impossible situations. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? Tell us about a time when you proved them wrong in the comments below.